Let's talk about writing villains for games. Most villain tutorials are about non-interactive media, like books and movies. Games are interactive. Players play as the protagonist. That changes how they experience the story and how they experience the villains. I don't want to teach you how to make the best possible villain, period. Instead, what I'd like to bring up is the structural differences between a video game, or a tabletop RPG, and something passive, like a movie. I think if we understand these structural differences, we can make villains that work in our games, rather than creating a movie villain and trying to staple it into a game. Right? Let's get started with a really easy action item. The power mirror. So many video games, tabletop RPGs, whatever, are going to give the main character some kind of special power. Like maybe they can rewind time, or maybe a magic space crystal gave them magic space crystal powers, or whatever, right? They can do something that is cool and unique because that is going to give the power fantasy an easier time. So you give them a special power, they have a fun time with it. The basic idea is you also give that power to other people. It doesn't have to be the exact same power. It could be a twisted version or an inverted version or a counter to that power, but the basic idea is that you put a whole bunch of that out into the world. Not like everybody, but a lot of people have similar powers. Do you have the power to rewind time? Well, here's someone with the power to pause time, or here's someone with the power to also rewind time or fast forward through time. Do you have the power to have magic space crystals in your head? Well, here's someone with a similar power that uses it in a different way. Now, obviously, this is not video game specific. For example, Star Wars. Luke has the Force, and so does Obi-Wan Kenobi, and so does Darth Vader, and so does the Emperor. They all have different takes on what the Force is, how it should be used, and who they are relative to it. In terms of storytelling, this is very powerful because it allows you to show the player, or the audience in general, all of the different ways that this sort of situation could go. Sure, Luke is a good guy, at least you think he's a good guy, but look at how this power could be twisted and corrupted if it was in the wrong hands. Look how desperate people might use it wrong. Look how you can fall so easily to using it wrong. You can tell all of these stories in the same space without having to have them happen to the main character. But in a video game, it's especially useful because it's gameplay. Presumably, you gave the main character this power in your video game because it's cool to actually use it in gameplay. Oh man, rewinding time is super cool. Or whatever. Like, oh look, I made a game where you have a cool jetpack, and you're jetpack man flying around and it's fun to fly around on the jetpack, right? But we need some more gameplay. We need to have more stuff, more interesting things that we can do with this jetpack. And the instinct is, oh, well, we'll put in obstacle courses or something. The real instinct should be, oh, well, here's evil jetpack. He's a government jetpacker who's going to oppose you. Or here's the anti-jetpack firing squad or whatever, right? Or the giant robot they built to take on jetpacking people. Whatever, right? By giving other characters in the story similar or opposing powers, some kind of power mirror, you can quickly create all sorts of new obstacles for the player. And many of those obstacles are going to be villains. They may also be friends that aren't exactly as helpful as you might hope. We can make new gameplay out of the power mirror while at the same time creating compelling villains. Sounds like it's a win-win to me. We can do all sorts of stuff by simply understanding that this gameplay exists and is cool, and we should use it in other ways. So, another point worth mentioning here is Emergent Strife. I'm one of the people who is of the opinion that there is no such thing as a good villain in a vacuum. I don't think that anybody can design a good villain just, hey, I'm Mr. Villain. I'm the best villain that's ever been designed. I don't think that's ever going to work. Every villain exists within a story and emerges from a story. That's kind of the point of the power mirror, right? Your power is a core part of the story, and the villain emerges from it to help highlight it and extend it. Well, Emergent Strife is the same way. The basic idea is that if you want to write a better villain, you don't focus on the villain, you focus on the story that contains the villain. If you want a better villain, write a story that needs a better villain. And one easy way to do that is to keep your eye out for Emergent Strife. So let me give you an example. We got a fantasy game where our hero walks out into the woods and happens upon a fantasy super powerful cool sword. And like, oh, sword! And then they go around the world righting wrongs. There's no spot for a villain to arise here. There's no Emergent Strife in this summary. We need to create some kind of reason that there is opposition. We need to create some kind of place for villains to emerge out of. Well, one instinct that you might have is to say that the sword has some kind of magic that draws other monsters or something similar, right? This is a very common thing to do in, say, a comic book. Oh, look, he has a special magic power, and it just so happens that it also attracts every demon in the universe, or whatever. This isn't a very interesting kind of enemy to fight. These enemies don't really want anything. They don't really serve to pull the story forward. They're just something to defend against. We're going to get more into that as to why it's bad in a little while. But from our perspective, the problem here isn't really that this is Emergent Strife. This is just strife. We need it to be emergent, something that grows over time and evolves. And not something we have to force to grow over time, but something that intrinsically as a concept is already growing over time and changing over time. For example, this hero is wandering around the world, righting wrongs and growing ever more powerful with his cool sword. Well, I think that the governments are going to take notice of that. So obviously what we have is a series of fantasy nations that want this main character either controlled or killed. And the stronger the main character gets, and the more nations whose toes he steps on, the more likely that he's going to get embroiled in international warfare. Similarly, hey, that guy just found a super magic sword out in the woods. Clearly, we should be raiding every single archaeological site we can find looking for similar super magic swords. And so now the whole world is getting covered in grave looters desperately looking for new super magic swords. Some of them are going to find super magic swords. Some of those places were guarded by ancient monsters that you killed. And now they come in to steal what's left. This is easy Emergent Strife. We can always get villains out of this. Anytime we need a villain, we can simply look at the state of the world and the state of the player and say, okay, well, obviously this villain would do well today. This kind of villain from this kind of place. And hey, as it happens, we also installed some power mirrors because we can have other magic swords getting found. So we can combine these two really, really easily, and we would never run out of villains. When we need a villain, we can get a villain. If we don't need a villain, we can yoke it back and not have a villain. And there's no sense that we're forcing things. There's no sense that it's just villains for the sake of villains. It's all natural. It's all emergent. Of course the governments are going to get upset about this guy with a super magic sword wandering around freeing people. This is what I mean when I say that we should focus on having some Emergent Strife, because villains can spring forth from this really easily. All sizes of villains. And they'll always have something they care about, something they want. They'll have a reason to fight against the player character, but that reason isn't, I'm evil. It's something more substantial. They're fighting against the player character for a reason. By creating a story that structurally has Emergent Strife in it and structurally has power mirrors in it, we allow those villains to come out into the open really easily, really effortlessly. But maybe you're thinking, gosh, that sounds fine, but that's not really super entangled with it being a video game. I mean, Power Mirror provides gameplay, sure, but what about video game specific stuff? Well, let's hit this final topic, player control. I mean, this is the point, right? The whole point of a video game is that the player is in control. This is why the game gets played. One of the things that modern gaming does that is just absolutely right, the best way to do things, it never takes control away from the player. The player is always in 100% complete control. And the way you can always remember this is the fact that you literally cannot take control away from the player because they can always just shut your game off. No matter what you do, you cannot take control away from the player. It's just physically impossible. They will always have ultimate control over your game. But let's get down to something a little bit more diegetic. So you're running in GTA 5 or 6 or whatever. The characters in that game all have really noxious personalities, or mostly have noxious personalities, and generally speaking, the player would not want them to act on their various noxious personalities while the player is trying to actually do stuff. But the game does want them to have a story. That's the whole point. They made these characters noxious specifically to help tell the story they wanted to tell. So, how does the game tell that story if they're not allowed to take control away from the player? It's easy. They ask the player to give up control. In order to have one of the characters actually, do anything in character, you have to walk into these glowing circles and also hit A. The game literally asks you to give up control. It's like, if you step in this circle and hit A, I will take control of you, your character, for a little while. And the player is like, got it. Here's me pressing A and giving you control, explicitly, for the sake of letting you make this character do dumb shit. This is great because it means that the protagonist, the character in the video game, can screw up, can suffer, can do whatever, and it's not the player getting blamed for it. The player didn't get shafted. The player gave up control because the protagonist was about to get shafted, and that needed to be made, that needed to be in the story. This is basically universal. For example, if you play as Guybrush Threepwood in an adventure game, Guybrush will go around doing, random stuff, but Guybrush almost never does random stuff on his own. He almost always asks for permission by only doing random stuff in response to the player interacting with something that would clearly make him do random stuff. Now, we can get into great detail as to the nature of this, but really we're still talking about villains. Villains, right? The whole point of a villain is that they take control. That's basically what they're about. So how does this work? Well, the answer is that the villain is opposed to the protagonist, not to the player. In reality, the villain and the player are on the same side. They both want an interesting story to happen. And so basically, the villain essentially asks permission for, before taking out the main character, before doing horrible things to the main character. And normally this is done by just having a glowing spot on the ground which says, warning, once you step here, the next chapter will start. And, bad things are going to happen. Tidy up all your side quests first. This tells the player, okay, when I step there, it's going to be story time. The characters are going to do character stuff. The villains are going to step in and, do villain stuff. And I'm along for the ride. I'm giving away some control. So let me give you an example of how not to do this. Very minor Final Fantasy XIV spoilers coming up. Right. I'm fighting against the most recent overpowered villain. I think this is villain 9476. He is spiky, 8-foot-tall armor dude. I think he's the 12th spiky, 8-foot-tall armor dude in the villain roster of Final Fantasy XIV. To make it clear, he's the one with the giant rotary cannon full of swords for no discernible reason. This villain is a terrible video game villain because he's a movie villain. There are two big problems with this villain. The first problem is he's not actually very good in combat. Anybody who is a tank can easily solo this guy. But the game needs you to lose to him. So they literally just make you lose. Like, tanks have an ability to become immortal. They have the ability to literally just be immortal for 10 seconds. And this guy will just ignore it and cut to cutscene and pretend that you lost. This is a betrayal of player control. We didn't tell the game it had permission to ignore our efforts. We didn't tell the game it had permission to make us lose. If the game wanted us to lose a fight, then the game should have kept ramping up the difficulty, not just fiat made us lose. This character has a couple of other situations like that where they will just by fiat dominate, and it never feels very realistic. It always feels super forced, and it is always removing player control. But one of the more important aspects of this is that he doesn't give the player any control, and this is a really complicated topic. So essentially, the purpose of a villain is not to take control away from the player. The purpose of the villain is to give the player more control, to give them more things that they feel like they want to do. The purpose of a villain is to pull the player forward into the game world, into the plot, into active duty. But this guy doesn't do that. All of his plot lines are, I'm here to fight. Anybody here know how to fight? No, none of you know how to fight because I cut to a cutscene and I always win. All right. See you later, dudes. He doesn't ever have anything that pulls the player forward or makes the player more interested in the world or makes the player want to do anything. He's just there to be a big wall that the player runs into. Player control goes both ways. You don't want to take control away from the player by, cutting to an arbitrary cutscene where they lose. But at the same time, we can give the player more control. We can give the player a feeling of greater control by having our villains pull the player forward into a setting where it feels like their actions matter more. This is something where in a movie it wouldn't really work because we're not in control of Luke Skywalker. But we are in control of, I don't know, Garbage Man the 19th, whatever we named our character. And that means that when that character goes and does something more important, it feels like the player is doing something more important. And that's one of the main things we can do with our villains. So yes, we have to make sure that our villains don't arbitrarily take control away from the player, but it's not a minefield. It's an opportunity. We can use our villains to give the player more control, to pull them forward into the rest of the game. If we were going to use our fantasy setting that we did earlier with the sword that we found and all the governments that don't like us very much, the basic idea is that when people start to ravage the countryside looking for magic swords, when wars start to crop up, the player is stepping forward onto a much larger stage. Their actions are mattering much more. So we're using these villains, these government-sponsored villains, to pull the player into a larger stage and make their actions matter more, or seem like they matter more. In my opinion, these three elements are enough to help you build your game-specific villains. Just keeping these three things in mind will probably make your villains a lot more interesting than they would have been if you were just trying to follow a checklist of how to make a good movie villain. But I'm sure there are other aspects that I didn't bother to bring up, and this is already like 20 minutes long and this is my 900th take, so I'm going to leave you here. But feel free to talk about it down below and I'll chime in. See ya.